Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I would just like to start this episode off with fuck ice. Caucasus Mountains, 1864, on the edge of the Black Sea. Night falls over a burning village by the Black Sea. Circassian refugees huddled on the shore. A mother holds her child, whispering a lullaby in their endangered tongue. Around them, the air is thick with smoke and grief. Russian soldiers, silhouetted against the flames, herd the last of the villagers toward waiting boats. In the dying light, an empire's will is enforced by fire and steel. You kill the language, you kill the people. The mother whispers, clutching her son. She has heard the rumors. In distant imperial halls, they decreed her nation must vanish. Behind her, the Caucasus Mountains, her ancestors' home for millennia, are now emptier. Ahead, the black waters churn. Thousands of Circassians will soon be forced onto overcrowded ships, exiled from their homeland. Disease and starvation will stalk them. Bodies will wash up on the shore among the waves. The child in her arms coughs, eyes dull. The mother hums a final lullaby as the fire consumes all she has known. Ukraine, 2022. A subterranean basement in Mariupol. By the flicker of a candle, a school teacher named Irina kneels before a small pile of books. Above, muffled shelling. The city shudders. She runs her fingers over the books. Ukrainian literature, history, language textbooks. And she fights back tears. They're coming. The soldiers. They're coming for our books, for our words, for our children. Irina has heard what happens in other occupied towns. The empire always comes for the children, elders warned her. And indeed, as soon as the Russian troops took her city, they started hunting down the very things that keep Ukraine alive. Its language, its memory. Ukrainian books have been yanked off library shelves and burned en masse by occupation authorities, replaced with Russian textbooks. Neighbors whisper about teachers being arrested and tortured for refusing to teach Russian. Irina refuses to be complicit. By candlelight, she resolves to preserve these books, to bury them if she must, so that someday, if her pupils return, they can remember who they are. Above her, the thunder of a Russian artillery barrage draws closer. She gathers the books, her hands shaking, but steady. Empires have long known a dark truth. If you erase a people's language, their history, and their children's memories, you erase the people. Few empires pursued this with the tenacity of Russia. Centuries ago, as the Russian czars expanded their realm across Eurasia, they fought what we might call native wars. Wars against the indigenous people who stood in the way of imperial unity. The strategy was brutally effective. Conquer the land, and then conquer the soul of those who lived on it. In the 19th century, Tsarist Russia's policy of Russification took direct aim at the identities of minority peoples. After quashing a rebellion in 1863, Alexander II decreed that the empire's diverse subjects must accept the Russian culture to snuff out any dream of independence. In practice, this meant banning local languages, flooding native homelands with Russian settlers, and crushing any institutions of self-expression. The logic was simple and chilling. Forcing them to accept Russian culture was an attempt to prevent self-determination and separatism. In other words, destroy what makes them a people, and they will never again rise up. One infamous example came in 1876 with the Ems Ukaz, a secret decree by Tsar Alexander II banning the Ukrainian language in print. Ukrainian books, plays, even song lyrics were forbidden in their own homeland. Decades earlier, the Tsar's minister Pyotr Aleut had declared,
"There never was, is not, and cannot be any separate Ukrainian language. Their dialect is only a corrupted form of Russian,"
dismissing Ukrainian as nothing more than a corrupt dialect of Russian. These were not mere words. They were marching orders for cultural annihilation. With the stroke of a pen, an entire nation's tongue was marked for extinction. You kill the language, you kill the people. Ukraine understood that threat then, as it does now. Such pronouncements echoed through the decades, under both Tsarist and Soviet rule. Ukrainian culture suffered attack after attack. In the 1930s, Stalin's regime executed or imprisoned thousands of Ukrainian poets, scholars, and clergy, an event called the Executed Renaissance. But even these horrors did not fully erase Ukraine's identity. The language survived underground. The songs and stories were whispered among families when officials weren't listening. Fast forward to the 21st century, history repeats in grotesque fashion. Vladimir Putin, modern Russia's president, launched a full-scale war on Ukraine in 2022. His stated rationale? That Ukraine is not a real nation, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and Ukraine's independent identity is an error to be corrected. Denying the very existence of a separate people is the prelude to cultural devastation. Russian forces didn't just target military sites. They systematically went after the fabric of Ukrainian life. Schools in occupied areas were ordered to rip out any trace of Ukrainian language or history. The Russian Education Ministry bluntly removed Ukrainian language and literature from the curriculum. In captured territories, Ukrainian classes, even remote ones over the internet, were outlawed. Parents were threatened with losing custody of their children if they didn't send them to new Russian schools. Teachers who resisted were abducted, beaten, even deported for refusing to indoctrinate kids with the occupiers' curriculum. This is not quiet policy. This is a war on identity. One Ukrainian educator, Stanislav Fedorachuk, put it plainly. The occupiers understand perfectly well that cultural identity is very important. Russia's goal is to break the connection with the language. The invaders aim to raise a generation of Ukrainian children who cannot speak or think in their mother tongue. It is an attempt to hollow out Ukraine's soul. As Fedorachuk warned, a child who knows only Russian, taught to see Ukraine as illegitimate, will become part of the Russian world, the very outcome Moscow desires. When Russia can't win, it doesn't stop. It doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't back off. It escalates. It burns the food. It slaughters the animals. It kidnaps the kids. It kills the songs. And when people are gone, it rewrites the story. We're not talking about conquest. We're talking about erasure. After the Chukchi humiliated Russian soldiers, Moscow went after the Koryak. The Koryak weren't invaders. They were reindeer herders, hunters, nomads. They didn't ask for war. They just wouldn't pay the Tsar. So Russia burned their homes, shot their elders, and cut the throats of their animals. This isn't legend. It's in the Russian archives. Russian units waited until the men were gone hunting. Then they attacked, burned the food storage, left women and children in the snow. They didn't kill them all. They didn't have to. They let the winner finish it. Russia doesn't want land. It wanted obedience. No tribute, no survival.
They shot my father in the leg, burned our food, killed the dogs, said it was for the Tsar, but all I saw was ash.
In Alaska, Russia didn't even pretend to negotiate. They came for fur, otters, seals, whatever would sell in Europe, and they made the Aleut people hunt for them. Not trade, hunt. They took hostages, told the hunters, "Bring us the pelts or your families die." And if they resisted, they burned the village. Women were captured, children were starved. Men forced to row sea otter hunts in freezing water until they died. That's not tribute, that's a death sentence. Russia's commanders report they are docile after the burning. And once the bodies were broken, Russia went for the soul. They sent priests, built churches on sacred land, banned languages. Indigenous names were changed. Clothing was banned. Songs criminalized. Children were taken, given new names. Beaten for praying in their own language.
I said my grandmother's prayer. The priest hit me, said my name was a sin.
It wasn't education. It was fucking programming. Does it sound familiar? Because it should. Canada, United States, Australia, China. The empire always comes for the children. Russia didn't lose. It didn't retreat. It erased. The Koryak didn't surrender. They vanished. The Aleuts didn't break. They were worked to death. In Siberia, we have the lands of the Koryak. And, across the sea in Alaska, the Aleut peoples. Russia's empire was still young in the 1700s. Its eastern border crept relentlessly towards the sun, as Siberia's riches lured adventurers and soldiers. Conquest didn't come easy. Many indigenous nations refused to kneel. The Chukchi held their ground, de facto independent until the 1920s. But what of their neighbors, the Koryaks? What of the Aleut, also known as Unangan? The peoples beyond Kamchatka across the Pacific. The empire's methods evolved. First guns and steel, then Bibles and schools. Brutal physical suppression gave way to cultural erasure. It's the early 18th century. In the coastal tundra, north of Kamchatka, the Koryak people, reindeer herders, and coastal hunters, find themselves in the crosshairs of the advancing Russian Empire. The year is 1714. High on a cliff stands the wooden fortress of Bolshoi Posad, an Aleut Koryak stronghold. Inside, hundreds of Koryak families huddle, besieged by Cossack muskets and cannons. The air is thick with smoke and the stench of death. They have been under siege for months. There's no water. Every desperate raid for a drink has been beaten back with heavy losses. Starvation set in long ago. Men, women, even children are eating the dead to stay alive. Afanasy Petrov and his band of service Cossacks and mercenaries plan their final assault. They have come from the distant Anadyr fort with one goal: to break the Koryak resistance and force them to pay the Tsar's tribute, the Yasak fur tax, in full. These Cossacks are hardened and ruthless. For decades they have burned villages across Siberia when tribes refused to submit. A chronicler noted that in this period, Russian campaigns against rebellious Koryaks routinely involved ruthless pillage, capture of slaves, and sometimes even extermination of the whole settlement. By 1714, Bolshoi Posad is one of the last Koryak bastions still defying them. The final assault is underway. Cossacks swarm over the outer rampart, only to find a second inner fort where the last 300 Koryak warriors make a stand. Enraged, the attackers hurl more grenades. A powder keg inside the fort explodes, blasting bodies and timbers into the air. What follows is butchery. Not a single Koryak is spared. Not the warriors, not the old, not the women clutching infants. Even the few who had tried to surrender earlier and gave misleading information are executed on the spot. Bolshoi Posad, the largest Koryak settlement, is no more. The year is 1715. The Koryak War, as we might call it, has reached a bloody crescendo, but it's far from over. Over the next decades, violence ricochets back and forth. The Koryaks, though devastated, refuse to bow. Shockingly to the Russians, even the usual tactic of hostage-taking fails. Elsewhere in Siberia, had long extorted native compliance by kidnapping chiefs' family members. But the Koryaks are different. They simply did not bargain with their children's lives. A Russian observer spat that all of them are rough, vicious, and merciless people, unable to comprehend that these indigenous fighters would not trade freedom for the safety of a few captives. So the Russians resort to pure terror. In 1742, Empress Elizabeth in St. Petersburg issues an extraordinary order. She commands the cleansing of the Koryak and Chukchi peoples, to totally expel them from their native lands and erase their culture through war. The natives, she decrees, must be totally extirpated. This is genocidal intent sanctioned at the highest level. Captain Dmitry Pavlotsky, the same butcher who slaughtered Chukchi women and children in Part 1, is charged with carrying out this war with the help of Almighty God. The directive: kill the men, enslave the women and children as booty, and erase their way of life. Imperial Russia has openly embraced a campaign of annihilation. And yet, incredibly, the Koryak and their neighbors fight back. The mid-1740s see a wave of indigenous revolt. A tinderbox is lit. The Koryaks, Chukchi, Itelmen, Kamchadal, and Yukagir peoples, normally distinct groups, unite in desperation. They all united to drive the Russians out of their lands in the 1740s, even mounting an assault on the Russian fort at Nizhnekamchatsk in 1746. In 1753, Koryak fighters besieged the Gizhinkaya fortress, another Russian outpost. Bow and arrow against musket and cannon, they hold the fort's garrison in panic for months. For the Russian colonizers, these uprisings are a nightmare. For the Koryak and the Allies, they are a final cry of fury. The rebels managed to kill dozens of Cossacks in ambushes, even wiping out some detachments. But the Empire brought in reinforcements and heavier weaponry. Villages were burned in retaliation, one by one. The revolts were crushed by the late 1750s. The cost was immense on both sides, yet immeasurably higher for the indigenous. By one contemporary account, 50 unsubdued Koryaks were killed in a single assault on a Koryak fort. All defenders wiped out. This was repeated over and over again. The massacres and the smallpox epidemics that followed in the wake of Russian contact ravaged the population. Entire clans disappeared. In Kamchatka, homeland of the Itelmen, cousins of the Koryak, the native population collapsed from an estimated 150,000 to just 10,000. A mere 5% of the region's people today are indigenous. Historian John F. Richards noted that smallpox alone in the late 1600s killed up to 80% of some Siberian peoples. In the 1700s, saw the scourge return every few decades. But colonial violence did the rest. Cossack raids devastated the human and animal life in Kamchatka, slaughtering wildlife en masse, and starving the locals. 90% of the Kamchadals, or Itelmen, and half of the Vogels were killed from the 18th to 19th centuries, with a dozen distinct ethnic groups entirely wiped out by 1882. Let that sink in. 12 distinct peoples that once lived in Siberia have been exterminated. The Koryak themselves survived, but scarred. After the 1750s, the Russian government, seeing the region in ruins and profits dwindling, finally reduced the fur tribute demands on the Koryak. open conflict died down. By the late 18th century, the Koryak were considered pacified, though in truth, they had fought the Russians to a stalemate and forced concessions. Officially, they became subjects of the Tsar. In reality, many remained in their nomadic lifestyle, nursing their losses. Their numbers would recover only slightly over the next 300 years. 7,953 were recorded in the 2013 census. But a people is more than a head count. Their spirit has been battered, but not extinguished. They kept their language and traditions alive in secret, even as Orthodox missionaries arrived to civilize them. In 1959, fully 99.6% of Koryaks still spoke their native tongue, a testament to resilience. Yet, the long shadow of empire was only just beginning to fall. As the guns fell silent in Kamchatka, a new phase began. The assault on the soul of the people, language, faith, identity. We'll return to this cultural war, but first, to another indigenous nation about to face Russia's greed, the Aleuts of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands, a chain of storm-lashed volcanic islands stretching from Alaska towards Siberia. The people, the Unangan, known to outsiders as the Aleuts, skilled seafarers, kayak hunters of seals, and sea otters. The time, the mid-18th century. Just as the dust is settling in Kamchatka, the Russian Empire, having discovered Kamchatka, now casts its eyes further east across the water. Vitus Bering's voyages in 1741 confirmed that there were lands rich in fur beyond the Pacific. And so, the freelance Russian fur traders and Cossacks began hopping from island to island in the search of the soft gold. They are armed to the teeth and utterly unencumbered by scruples. At first, contact is sporadic. Russian crews wreck on the islands or come and go, trading beads for furs. But quickly, trade turns to plunder. By the early 1750s, reports reach the Unangan that these foreigners are committing atrocities. On Aleut Island in 1745, one band of Russians massacred 15 Aleut women and children to set an example. Why? To instill terror, to make subjugation easier. The Aleuts come to realize that what's arriving on their shores is not mere traders, but a fucking invasion. In 1763 and 1764, the Aleuts strike back. Fueled by outrage over rape and abuse of their women, Aleut warriors carry out a brilliantly coordinated rebellion. They attack 4 Russian ships across the islands, killing at least 160 Russian men and destroying their vessels. It's a stunning blow, an indigenous naval uprising against colonial predators. For a moment, the invaders are on the run. But the retribution is swift and terrible. A Russian trader named Ivan Solovev takes command of a punitive expedition. His name will be seared into Aleut memory as a byword for cruelty. Solovev arrives in the Aleutians in 1764 with a single-minded agenda: revenge. According to one account, he openly vows to reduce the Unangan population from 25,000 to 2,500. Whether or not the Aleuts numbered that many, Solovev's intent is clear: mass murder. He begins a systematic campaign of terror across Unalaska, Umnak, and neighboring islands. Villages that resist are wiped off the map. Solovev and his men burn towns, destroy every kayak and hunting tool they find, and kill without mercy. A Russian chronicler records that after burning one fortified village, he had 200 bodies tossed into the sea. Then, intercepted 2 large open boats of Aleut families traveling to visit relatives, and deliberately sank them, drowning everyone. On another island, the slaughter that followed was general. Solovev's strategy is hostage-taking and horror combined. In one case in 1764, he captured a local chief and released him on the condition that he leave his son as hostage. The message? Submit, or you'll never see your children again. Many Aleut leaders, desperate to stop the bloodshed, handed over hostages and furs, but some chiefs refused. One such holdout was a chief named Ichidak. He had killed Russians in battle and would not surrender. Solovyev spent the winter of 1764 and 1765 hunting him. That winter, famine set in among the Aleuts. Even so, Ichidak would not give up. Finally, in January 1765, a betrayal. Another Aleut leader, coerced by hunger, helped Solovyev ambush Ichidak's camp. The chief and 14 of his men were killed in a raid. With that, organized resistance collapsed. Solovyev unleashed an orgy of punishment. According to later accounts and oral tradition, he personally oversaw some atrocities of the unthinkable brutality. Near Beaver Inlet, a large group of Aleut families from several villages had fled to a remote island. Solovyev discovered their refuge. He attacked twice. On the second assault, his men broke through the defenders and slaughtered everyone, men, women, and children. The result was a bloodbath. By the late 1760s, the Aleut population had been shattered. One historical analysis found that between first Russian contact in 1741 and 1790, the Aleut numbers plummeted by 80 to 90%. Russian historian Boris Pierce noted Aleutians had perhaps 8,000 people in 1741, but only roughly 2,000 remained by 1834. Solovyev himself left the Aleutians around 1775, his mission accomplished. The island subdued in blood. Then he was gone, leaving a traumatized society in his wake. And what was left of Aleut society now fell under the control of the growing Russian-American fur enterprise. Independent hunters merged into companies. By 1784, merchant Grigory Shelikov arrived to establish a permanent colony on Koryak Island, just east of the Aleutians. The local people there were the Sugpiaq, related to Aleuts but distinct. Shelikov carried forward the terror tactics. When the Sugpiaq of Koryak resisted his landing, he lured hundreds to a small sanctuary rock, then attacked with cannon and musket, in what is now known as the Awawak Massacre, August 1784. Shelikov's men slaughtered anywhere from 200 to 3,000 men, women, and children. The estimates vary. Shelikov claimed a modest 200, but later accounts suggest a far higher total. The Russians, well armed and merciless, suffered no casualties. After the massacre, Shelikov took over 1,000 captives, including about 400 children, and held them as hostages. He then demanded that every remaining Sugpiaq chief surrender his children as well, to guarantee obedience. The few chiefs alive had no choice. Their own kids became bargaining chips for their people's survival. One Sugpiaq man, Arsenti Amniak, survived that massacre, and decades later recounted the horror. He remembered how 300 Sugpiaq people were shot by the Russians. When survivors returned to the island months later, the stench of the corpses polluted the air so badly that none could stay there. Refugee Rock was left uninhabited, a mass grave of a whole community. And then, Amanak adds the most haunting detail. After this, every chief had to surrender his children as hostages. I was only saved by my father's begging and many sea otter pelts. The empire always comes for the children. It's in its final logic of conquest. It is not enough to kill the adults. The next generation must be in hand. We've seen it in Kamchatka, Russians seizing Yukagir and Koryak children to enforce fur quotas. And now in Alaska, Shelikov's hostage-taking of children in 1784 marks a transition from pure physical domination to cultural subjugation. Those Sugpiaq and Aleut children would be raised under Russian thumbs, taught the Orthodox faith, the Russian language, used as interpreters and intermediaries. Like a boy called Kaspek, taken from Koryak as a child, who grew up to serve the Russians and even betrayed fellow natives. By seizing the children, the colonizers tighten a generational chokehold. It ensures that even if open war subsides, the values and identity of the indigenous society can be re-engineered. By 1799, the Russian-American Company formalized Russian rule in Alaska. The wild days were curtailed. No more random freelance murder sprees, in theory. But for the Unangan and the Aleut, the darkest years, 1780 to 1810, left an indelible wound. Between violence and disease pandemics, countless communities vanished. Russian records note an Aleut population crash from about 10,000 in 1784 to just 2,000 by the 1830s. The cultural genocide had begun as well. The survivors were baptized en masse in Orthodoxy, some sincerely, others by coercion, and they were drawn into the fur economy as serfs to the company. Their old ways of life, subsistence hunting, clan governance, spiritual traditions, were systematically undermined. In 1824, one enlightened bureaucrat, Baron Wrangel, took over the colonies and was shocked at what he found. Starvation and abuse still common, despite 2 decades of company control. He ended the brutal fur tribute in 1827. Shifting to regular trade, conditions improved somewhat, but demographically and culturally, the damage was done. A Russian census in 1834 counted a mere 2,000 Aleuts alive. 2,000 from a people that had numbered in the many thousands a century prior, now reduced to a scattering of villages under foreign rule. And so, by the early 19th century, the age of guns and blood in the Far East gave way to an age of crosses and decrees. The Russian Empire, having secured these lands through extreme violence, moved to consolidate control in a different fashion. The strategy that follows will sound familiar across colonized continents. Assimilate the indigenous, or erase them by other means. And that is where we will leave this episode. We'll pick up next time. If you can't tell, I'm sick. It is a chore to read every one of these lines. I must have edited out about 5,000 coughs. And my nose is running like a fucking water hose. But thanks for listening. Fuck ice.